Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you something different from the social science and psychology. Rather, I'm going to share with you something about biology and also the causes of the autism spectrum disorder. I suspect a majority of the audience would have a background of the social science, or rather they are not familiar with the biology or the genetics. So I will start my presentations by giving you some insights what is genetics is all about, and then I will follow by sharing with you how genetics or DNA would lead to certain predisposition or the susceptibility of their diseases, and what information can we get or obtain from our DNA sequences. And then we'll come into the topic of today, that is how genetics and is related to autisms, and also if there is an environmental factors that may play the role in causing the developments of the autism. And last but not least, a message that we'd like to convey today, that is to hope for collaborations between the biology and social science in order for us to tackle the autism spectrum disorders. Now let's talk about DNA. What is DNA? As if you have played Lego before, then assume that the DNA sequences is just like a bunch of blocks of the Legos. So each one of us will have Legos, and the Legos actually build the bones frame of life. And each of these buttons on the Legos here are essentially our DNA sequence. So what makes us different is probably that you will have more long blocks, and I will have more shorter blocks. Perhaps you will have more blue blocks, and I will have more yellow and green blocks. So these differences build, these blocks builds the life, builds the DNA sequence and build the life of us. But it also, because of the differences, different blocks that you have between you and me, and that makes us different. So that is all about the DNA, if you want to know. Of course, DNA are essentially built by 4 basic blocks and what we call as the A, T, C, and G. Now, the DNA blocks would essentially carry the genetic or the genetic information, or what we call as the codes of life, and this genetic information will be transformed or translated into different types of what we call as the proteins, and the proteins essentially will build, and these are the these proteins are the determinants of the life, essentially. So many proteins essentially will build us as the human. Now the interesting part is that each one of us are different. We look different, we behave different, we talk different. So these differences or the variations among the human are essentially, like I say, it is because of the variations in the genetic information or the DNA sequences. Now, the question is that how do we know, and what are the differences that make you and me different? And that's where we would want to look into the genetic or the DNA sequence. So essentially what I would like to summarize is that what is genetics? It is the study of the differences and the similarities of the DNA sequence between you and me, and then we would look into what makes you and me different, which part of the DNA sequence that makes you and me different, and why are we look different. And if we know that there are the differences between you and me, would there be any of the consequences in this difference? And that is what we call as the that is where the scope of the genetics are. Uh, so, so we know two things. One is the genetics are inherited. That's the reason why we call genetic inheritance. So we always say that like father, like son. So there are the genetic information will be transmitted from the parents to the children. And the other thing that would like to emphasize here is that genetic determines the traits. So therefore, majority of the traits are essentially, at least in part, attributed to the DNA variations that you and I have. So question is that in which way the genetic condition or genetic information can be inherited? Well, there are essentially several ways, but I'm going to summarize it in short, just one slide in a relatively short manner. That is, the first, genetic, all genes that we have between, that you and I have, are essentially two copies. Yeah, they're essentially two copies of genes that we have in our DNA, and when the fertilizations happens, and you have your kid, and the kid will carry half of the genetic information or half of the genes from the father, and receive another half of the genes from the mother. So essentially, there are 50% of the genes or traits that actually being inherited from the father, and another 50% of the traits or the characteristics that will be inherited from the mother. So if imagine that one of the gene, one copy of the gene, are essentially mutated, or would carry or would cause a disease, and that mutation are being received by the kid, then there is a chance or the likelihood of the kid would express or manifest a disease. But it also depends on what sort of disease it is. Certain disease you will require two copies of the mutation. Which means that one mutation received from the mother, father, and another half of one mutation that we receive from the mother before the disease could be expressed. And this is what we call as the recessive, autosomal recessive inheritance. So it depends on what sort of what kind of genetic conditions, inherited conditions that you receive from the kid receive, and therefore it manifests the disease traits. But there are also occasions whereby both parents, or even in family pedigrees, that do not show any such of the traits, but rather it expressed in one or few of the offspring or the siblings in the pedigree, and that's what we call as the de novo. And this occurs these conditions can be explained biologically, and that is because that during fertilizations there is apparently a mutation, or the error occurs in the process of the fertilization, and therefore a mutation occur, and this mutation essentially lead to a unique traits, so to speak, inverted comma, unique traits in the family line. So this is another types of the inheritance. Well, it is not, so to speak, inheritance, but rather it is because of the biological error that causes the mutation. And this is very common. Take it for example, chromosome 21 in Down syndrome. That is one of the typical examples as of how biologically Down syndrome could occur. The message that I would like to convey here is, first, genetic variation may result a change of a trait, or may result the occurrence of a trait, and the traits may be pathogenic, or they may cause into disease. And the third point I would like to convey here is that ideally all of us will have the equal chance of being affected by a disease, but somehow certain people would have a higher likelihood or higher risk of getting a disease compared to the others. And this applies to all diseases, and that includes the autism spectrum disorders as well. Now, we know what is DNA, we know how the mutation occurs, we know what are the consequences of the DNA variation, if at all there is any. So what kind of information that we can get from all these understandings? Yeah, the first is that if we know there is a mutation that is linked or attributed to certain disease, we can immediately identify from birth who are the ones that will be at risk for different health outcomes, and therefore a preparedness or counseling protocols and medication could be prepared from the beginning. Yeah, and we can predict the risk of certain diseases. For example, breast cancer. We know Angelina Jolie, who has who had went for a mastectomy because of having 87% risk of getting a breast cancer. So we can predict what is the risk of a certain disease, and we can seek for a best treatment that work for different people. Again, a breast cancer, it is already in the practice that if you were to seek for chemotherapy in breast cancer, then we will look for what kind of mutations that you carry, and hence which type of chemotherapy that would best fit you in order to treat on the breast cancers. So these are the advantages, or the advantages that we would be able to obtain if we know the genetic information of ourselves. Now, let's go to what spectrum disorder is. I'm sure that you guys would know a lot better about autism spectrum disorder. I wouldn't go into detail except to just recap that it is a developmental behavioral disorder that is also a syndrome that have the impaired communication, and that would have impact on their social skills, and also it is associated with a narrow, rigid, and repetitive behaviors, and that's these are the three major characteristics of the autism spectrum disorder. But nonetheless, it is being termed as the spectrum disorders. That's because that it has a wide range of the characteristics, and many times it is overlapped with many other psychological disorders. So, and that is simply because of one brain that causes all these variations and wide spectrums of the characteristics. So the question is that it's autism spectrum disorder and inherited disease. Certain people would argue yes, certain people would argue no, and the fact is that I would say that yes and no. That's because that the twin studies that we actually been looked into, and they found there's a strong inherited factors of the autism spectrum disorders, but nonetheless it does not explain all reasons, and the recent estimation is there would be approximately 15 to 40% of the autism spectrum disorder could be explained by genetic cause, but there are remaining 60% that are often unknown, and it is often these 60% unknown are likely to be caused by the environmental exposures. So I would say that autism spectrum disorder, it's a combination and the interactions between genetic and the non-genetic factors. Certain cases where we look into the families with multiple siblings of having a ASD, and then we would know that the chances of the genetic inheritance is likely to be higher as compared to the rest. But there are certain cases whereby genetic is only the risk factor, but it comes to the interactions when it being triggered by many other external factors, and that would lead to the expression of the autism spectrum disorder, which will come into this very shortly. So, like I said just now, there are cases if you look into, and there's always a questions by the parents asking why, when the both of us or even the family line are all normal and we have a kid that is showing the syndrome. So again, I would explain this as de novo mutations, whereby there's likely to be an error during the fertilizations, and then the next question would come: why is there an error? And yet the rest are just normal. Now the error, there are many reasons, and the exact reasons of these errors, the occurrence of this error is yet to be explained. But often we say it is likely due to the exposure of certain factors externally. So and that is what we call as the environmental factors. So what are the factors that may cause or lead to the developments of the ASD? So the environmental or the exposure could happen pre-conception. It could happen during prenatal stage, or even the first 2 years of postnatal. So the risk factors are listed as includes nutrition, various types of the pollutants, toxins, you name it, endocrine disruptive compounds, or what we call now recently is all the microplastics and etc. So these are the very small, tiny cumulative toxins in maternal bodies or in the baby and during the first 2 years that may eventually lead to the development of this autism spectrum disorder. Medications that have been taken by mother during prenatal conception stage, or even the severe infection happens during mother's pregnancy, radiation, mother's metabolism, all the causes. And not to surprise that father would also play a role in causing the susceptibility of ASD, the paternal age, the father's age 45 and above would likely have more than 50%, or somebody even some even claim at 80% of a risk of getting delivering an autism baby. So yes, father's age is also one of the factors that may lead to the increased risk of autism. Now, with all these factors, would that contribute to the autism? Like I said, no. Essentially, all these factors, combinations of all these factors, which will interact with the genetic or your DNA sequence, and that causes into what we call as the genetic imprint, and causes the changes of the genetic in any of the stage during the genetic in your genetic information, and causes the change of the gene activity, and eventually it will lead to the autism spectrum disorder. So I always would like to emphasize that ASD, yes, is a genetic disorder, but this genetic disorder will always come into a complex interactions between the external or the environmental factors before ASD could be expressed. So we know that now the genetic has factors is being identified. Well, there are more than 100 genes are being identified now that is related to the autism spectrum disorders, and we know that there are many other environmental pollutants and factors that may interact with genes that will lead to autism spectrum disorder. The fact is that why do we need to know about the genetics of ASD? Parents would say that I have a baby of ASD. There's nothing could stop me, or nothing could be changed even if you know the cause of of the ASD, and that is very true. That is very true. But the fact is that knowing the cause of the ASD, or knowing the genetics of the ASD, that will help us in future. Not only, probably not your kid, but many of our communities in the autism spectrum disorder. The first thing is that it can help us to guide the management of the autism spectrum disorders. So with the new gene discovery, we are able to explain more cases of autism, and each of which we have their own sets of the behavior, and many will be associated with the medical concerns. And then with identifying the genetic imprints of these autism spectrum disorders, we would be able to categorize or the subtypes of the many of these autism cases, and therefore there would be a lot more specific treatments and training strategies that can be included, and that would help the treatments a lot more effective. Not to mention, if we know the genetic causes, then a more effective medications could be developed in order for us to treat ASD in future. This will not happen in the next 1 or 2 years, but it will definitely give us a hope, and that's what the Western scientists are currently doing now. Unfortunately, this biology of the autism, it's pretty scarce in this part of the world, in Malaysia. Like I said just now, genetics or the biology of the autism is really well known in the Western countries, but it's almost nil in Malaysia. So and understanding the biology or the cause of autism could be an alternative way, or could produce or could provide hints or further insights of how autism could be treated, at least to be managed in certain way, in certain manner. And therefore I would like to call for transdisciplinary and borderless research collaborations to all of us here as a scientist, so be in life scientist or the social scientist, in order for us to tackle ASD in a holistic manner, and with that we can have a more comprehensive strategy for us to help the ASD children. Unfortunately, I'm not able to take any of the questions at the moment, but I'll be very happy if any one of you would have any comments or suggestions or questions. I'll be happy to take your comments, questions, suggestions via the email. So you can just drop me a line here through my email, and I'll be happy to address your questions. And also, with that, I would like to thanks for your attention. Thank you.